In this series, we're going to go over cards that are currently in the modern ban list and discuss why they're banned, if they could be unbanned, and how to fix them so they might be unbanned. Today, we're going to go over some pretty infamous cards, so this should be pretty interesting. Starting us off, we have Lurrus of the Dream Den. This is a 3/2 legendary cat nightmare with a mana cost of 1 and 2 hybrid white-black mana, which can be paid with either black or white. It has Companion. Each permanent card in your starting deck has a mana value of 2 or less. This means that at the beginning of the game, if you meet this requirement, you can reveal this card from your sideboard at the start of the game, and then you can pay 3 mana on your turn to put it from your sideboard into your hand. It also has lifelink, meaning it dealing damage also causes you to gain that much life, and it has the ability where, during each of your turns, you can cast a permanent spell with a mana value of 2 or less from your graveyard. This card was banned in March of 2022, meaning at the time of writing, it was only banned for about 6 months. So, why is this card banned? This is a bit of a different one. You see, Lurrus wasn't broken in any one deck, rather it was basically just played in everything. It's really easy to only play permanent cards with mana value of 2 or less, and in fact, in formats like Modern, you're generally encouraged to play the cheapest cards available, because games are just so fast. Running lots of cheap cards may give you a better early game, but it gives you a weaker late game. Fortunately, Lurrus completely shores up this weakness. You can play a deck with nothing but streamlined, efficient cards, and then still have a late game thanks to always having access to Lurrus. Because most decks are able to fulfill the card's restriction without giving up much of anything, and because this card required you to give up basically nothing, almost every deck played Lurrus when it was legal. However, Lurrus didn't only homogenize the format by making everyone play it, it also homogenized the format by pushing tons of different cards out of the format. Lots of decks that could play Lurrus could also play cards like Gurmag Angler and Bedlam Reveler, which are both cards that cost more than 2 mana, but have ways to make themselves cheaper. Decks would consider playing cards like this all the time, but you would basically never trade playing Lurrus to be able to run these cards. Lurrus is just better when you look at it from just about every angle. Sure, Reveler can give you a better late game by letting you draw extra cards, but Lurrus does the same thing, and you don't have to draw into it. Sure, delve spells like Gurmag are big threats, but why play them when you can use Lurrus to recast all your Tarmogoyfs again? On top of all that, Lurrus was a free 8th card in your opening hand every game, giving it an even bigger edge over all these other cards. It's hard to convey just how ubiquitous the card was when it was unbanned. Not only was it seeing play everywhere, it was shaping what decks were good and what cards you played in those decks. Cards that saw a little bit of play beforehand, like Mishra's Bauble, started to see play everywhere because of how it interacted with Lurrus, essentially letting you draw another card every turn. Worst of all, because of how the mechanic worked, you were seeing it basically every game. Usually your opponent has to at least draw into the power cards, but Lurrus tutored itself up at the start of every game. Seeing how powerful and ubiquitous the card was, and how it wasn't ever going to go away, Wizards ended up banning the card to make the metagame more diverse. Could Lurrus be unbanned? No, none of the problems have gone away. Sure, there are some decks that wouldn't play Lurrus, but a huge number of decks still would, and it would homogenize all those decks a ton. Not to mention, a big part of why this card was banned was because of how hated it was by the community. People really didn't like the impact it had on games and how many cards it pushed out of the metagame, so they'd be very unhappy to see it return. How could Lurrus be fixed to be unbanned? The only real fix is just completely removing the companion ability. This is a topic we can make an entire video about, but the gist is that introducing these kinds of mechanics completely change how a card game is played. Commander plays entirely different than the rest of Magic, largely to having a commander you can cast every game. Other games like Yu-Gi-Oh! With a similar mechanic play entirely differently because of their extra deck. Ask any Yu-Gi-Oh! Player, they'll tell you that if the extra deck was removed, it would be an entirely different game. Introducing companions essentially changes the way Magic plays at a fundamental level. This is why the community's opinion on companions is generally that all of them should be banned, or the companion ability should be eroded and essentially deleted. The cards are either too good, or just about every deck is playing them, or they're too restrictive and not worth playing at all. Looking at the other companions, all the ones that have restrictions that players can meet without making their decks terrible see play, and all the ones that are too restrictive, like Umori the Collector, just don't see any play at all. They're essentially only used as a free card for decks that could already play them. Lurrus was the worst because it was incredibly powerful on top of being essentially free to play for a lot of decks. The only fix is giving it a worse restriction, which is basically just removing the companion ability, or taking its abilities away, which is just making it an entirely different card. Even bumping up the mana cost wouldn't quite do enough. Wizards already did that by eroding the entire mechanic to cost 3 extra mana to use, and Lurrus still got banned anyway. Again, this is something we could spend an entire video covering, and if you want to see that, you should go ahead and tell us in the comments down below. Next up, we have Oko, Thief of Crowns. This is a legendary planeswalker with a mana cost of 1, 1 green and 1 blue, and a starting loyalty of 4. It has the abilities where you can plus 2 him to make a food token, which is an artifact token with the ability where you can pay 2, tap, and sacrifice it to gain 3 life. It has the ability where you can plus 1 it to turn target artifact or creature into a 3/3 green elk with no abilities. You can also -5 it to exchange control target artifact or creature you control and target creature your opponent controls with power 3 or less. This card was banned in January of 2020. Why is Oko banned? It's a bit hard to put into words how much control over a game an early Oko can have. You see, Oko can make your board full of creatures, or remove almost any threat your opponent plays all on its own, and it can do all of this while gaining loyalty. You see, by using Oko's +2 to make a food, and then using his +1 to turn it into an elk next turn, you can make a 3/3 elk every other turn. On the other hand, if you don't want to make many elks, you can use the +1 to shrink your opponent's threats into 3/3s, and then just trade them for any elk you've made. With the help of mana dorks like a Gilded Goose to give you extra mana, you can get Oko out as early as turn 2. There's not really any creature your opponent could play at that point that could kill Oko in one swing, which means he'll probably be able to make an elk to contest the board. This means you'll have to put a lot of resources into killing your opponent's Oko, and they'll just be able to keep making blockers the entire time. This isn't even taking into account anything else they play on their turn. And all of this is happening while Oko is getting more loyalty and becoming harder and harder to kill. It's worth comparing this to other 3-mana planeswalkers to see what similar powerful cards could be doing for this much mana. Gris the Hunger Tide lets you make a 1/1 green and black insect token on a +1, and you can -2 him to sacrifice a creature, and when you do, you destroy target creature or planeswalker. Oko takes a bit longer, but he makes much larger creatures that are likely to trade in combat with your opponents. He can't straight up remove a creature, like Gris can, but he can do it on a plus, and it doesn't require you to sacrifice anything to use the ability. On top of that, since Oko makes you 3/3s, turn your opponent's creature into a 3/3 is basically removing it a lot of the time. Liliana of the Veil can make both players discard a card on a +1, and can force your opponent to sacrifice a creature on her -2. The story is similar here. Oko can't quite completely remove a creature, but he can do it on a +1. If we compare all these cards, we can see that Oko has abilities that are slightly better and gain him loyalty instead of costing loyalty. And both of these two planeswalkers are considered pretty strong and still see play in Modern to this day. This is the big difference between Oko and these cards. Oko isn't too bad if you can get rid of him right away, but he does have a big impact on the game the turn you play him, and if he doesn't get removed, he'll start to run away with the game and become pretty much impossible to kill. The combination of being so hard to remove and being so strong led to this card being a huge headache to deal with, and Wizards banned this card because it was way too strong. At the time of its ban, Oko appeared in about 40% of competitive Modern decks, which is a huge overrepresentation for a card like this. This is a 2-color card that only specific decks can play, and it pushes you into a pretty specific deck archetype. For the format to be that bent around it shows that it was clearly warping the format too much. Could Oko be unbanned? No. It would still be amazing in the decks that would want it, and some of the best decks in the format could be made better by including the card. This card is still really hard to beat, and the shells the card would be played in have only gotten more powerful. How could Oko be fixed to be unbanned? This is something that's been talked about a lot, but Oko's abilities gaining him too much loyalty is where most of his problems come from. If the ability to make him food was a +1, and the ability to turn them into an elk was a -1, the card would be very strong still, but fair. The real issue is that Oko gains too much loyalty far too quickly for people to catch up with if it comes down early, and they don't immediately have the answer. So lowering the amount of loyalty he gains would fix the issue. Next up, we have Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. This is a 6/6 legendary Elder Giant with a mana cost of 1 green and 1 blue. It has Escape for 2 green and 2 blue, and exile 5 of the cards from your graveyard, which means you can cast it from your graveyard for its escape cost. It has the abilities where, when it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it unless it escaped. And whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you draw a card, gain 3 life, and then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Uro was banned in February of 2021. Why is Uro banned in Modern? Uro is a really strong late game threat that you have to have very specific answers for to actually deal with. Because it can come back any number of times and draws you a card every time it enters the battlefield, simply destroying it every time they cast it isn't enough. If you do that, Uro will almost certainly run away with the game. That's assuming they have the answers every time. If they can't kill it, then Uro is really scary. 6/6 is really big in terms of stats, and the extra card every turn can make it basically impossible to come back from. Now, being an amazing late game threat is great, but there are tons of good late game threats, even ones that are recursive that aren't banned. For example, Uro's cousin, Kroxa, is really strong for all the same reasons as Uro, and sees tons of play, but he's not banned anywhere. The issue is that Uro's enter the battlefield and attack trigger is just far stronger. For one, Uro will always get you value, as you can always draw a card, but Kroxa won't get a card to your opponent's hand unless they have one. Additionally, Uro is better to play out of your hand than Kroxa is. Cards like Explore allow you to draw a card and then play an extra land for 2 mana. Explore is a pretty strong card that sees play in formats like Modern. Uro only asks for 1 more mana, and it allows you to gain some life and gives you access to cast an Uro from the graveyard later. This means that it's already a pretty strong card. And that's not even getting to how strong it is as a late game threat. The combination of being a strong spell on the front end and being a great card in the late game made it very hard to beat. Most cards that give you this strong of a late game are kinda bad, or at least subpar, if you draw them early, but Uro is great at every stage of the game. There really wasn't a point to playing any other color combinations if you were mid-range or control deck, as going blue-green and playing Uro was always just better. So to make these decks less dominant and to make more space for color combinations for mid-range decks, Wizards banned this card. Could Uro be unbanned? No, Green-Blue X would still benefit too much from it, and it would push already good decks like Yorion Blink decks into an even more dominant position in the metagame. How could Uro be fixed to be unbanned? This card's in a pretty rough spot from a design perspective, as it's supposed to be a mirror of Kroxa, and all of its abilities reflect that. Changing any of them would kind of mess up the idea. The best way to keep all of the effects and keep it similar to Kroxa would probably be to make it so that you can either gain 3 life, draw a card, or put a land into play on its enter the battlefield or attacks trigger. This would make casting from your hand a lot worse, so it would be close to where Kroxa is in power level. It would still be better than Kroxa, but it wouldn't be so strong as to push everything else out of the format. As strong as Uro is in the late game, the fact that casting him from your hand was so close to just being a playable card on its own is what made it so oppressive. Next, we have Mycosynth Lattice. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 6. It has the abilities where all permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types, all cards that aren't on the battlefield, spells, and all permanents are colorless, and finally, players can spend mana as though they were mana of any color. Mycosynth Lattice was banned in January of 2020. Why was Mycosynth Lattice banned exactly? On its own, the card doesn't do much. However, there are a few synergies with the card that makes it a lot scarier. Specifically, Karn, the Great Creator. This is a planeswalker with a mana cost of 4 and the abilities where the activated abilities of your opponent's artifacts can't be activated. You can +1 Karn to turn target non-creature artifact into an artifact creature with power and toughness equal to its mana value until your next turn. And you can -2 him to find an artifact card you own from your exile or your sideboard, reveal it, and put it into your hand. The important part of these two cards are Karn's ability to prevent your opponent from activating artifacts, and Mycosynth Lattice's ability to make all permanents artifacts in addition to their other types. You see, tapping your lands for mana is an activated ability, and since they're now artifacts, they won't be able to tap for mana anymore. This means that once you get Karn and Lattice down, your opponent won't be able to cast any more spells unless they happen to cost 0 mana. Now, it's worth mentioning that Mycosynth Lattice existed for years with similar combos being available and not seeing play. Cards like Stony Silence can do basically the same thing with Lattice, but they never saw play together. There are two big differences here though. First off, Karn's effect is one-sided, meaning you can still keep casting all your spells, whereas Stony Silence will stop you too. The second, even bigger difference is that Karn can actually find your Lattice for you. This is the really big problem. Unlike combining Lattice with Stony Silence, which is a 2-card combo, Karn with Lattice in the sideboard is basically a 1-card combo. As soon as you get 10 mana, you can just play Karn and fetch Lattice to lock down the game. This is way too hard to deal with. Decks that can make this much mana are usually full of big, expensive threats that can end the game, which will force your opponent to either try to win very quickly, or use resources answering their threats. This is a problem because you need to keep your mana open to deal with the Karn Lattice lock, because you have to answer one of the pieces as soon as they cast them, or you'll be locked out forever. This just wasn't practical given how many other threats they were playing, and so Wizards banned Mycosynth Lattice to weaken these decks and allow for more counterplay. Could Mycosynth Lattice be unbanned? No, not with Karn still legal in the format. Honestly, only one of the two needs to be banned, and considering that Lattice was legal for years in the format with no issues, it kinda seems like Karn is the actual problem card in the combo. Still, that's a much larger discussion that would involve going into how Karn is currently seen play to see if he should be banned instead. The real takeaway is that just one of them does still need to be banned. How could Mycosynth Lattice be fixed to be unbanned? There's not much you can do besides just removing the text to turn everything into an artifact. The efficiency of the combo doesn't really even matter very much. Karn is still tearing up Modern, and even if you increase the cost of Lattice to 9 mana, people would still play it, because giving up a sideboard slot is just such a small cost that the upside of just winning the game if you can pull it off vastly outweighs it. One fix is making it so that Lattice only turns non-land cards into artifacts, but that essentially neuters the card entirely. There's basically no way to fix the card without either making it unplayably bad, or just entirely changing the ability. And to round off this video, we have Tibalt's Trickery. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It has the effect where you counter target spell, then its controller mills 1, 2, or 3 cards chosen at random. Then they exile cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card with a different name. They can cast that spell without paying its mana cost, then they put all the other cards they exile on the bottom of their library in a random order. This card was banned in February of 2021. Why is Tibalt's Trickery banned? You see, this card isn't actually very good at stopping your opponent. Red might not get very many counter spells, but the risk of giving your opponent another better spell is too great. However, if you use it to counter your own spells and build your deck right, you can use it to cheat out massive threats, like Urmikul the Aeon's Torn or Omniscience extremely early. The best way to do this is with Cascade spells. Cascade is a mechanic where, whenever you cast a spell with Cascade, you exile cards to the top of your deck until you exile a card that costs less. You can cast that spell without paying its mana cost, and then you put all the exile cards on the bottom of your deck in a random order. By casting a spell like Violent Outburst and not playing any cards that cost less than 3 mana besides Trickery, you can make sure that you'll always find a Trickery off of an Outburst. Then, since Outburst will still be on the stack, you can use Trickery to counter it and then spin it into one of your payoffs. Now, the interesting thing about this card is that it wasn't banned because it was too good. Rather, Wizards felt the deck created a lot of non-games where your opponent either happens to have the counterspell for your combo, or they don't. Neither player really had to put much thought into their plays, and there wasn't that much counterplay unless you already happened to be playing cards that were good against the deck. This was generally considered by both Wizards and the community to be unfun and uncompetitive, so the card was banned. Now, before we continue, I want to discuss why Trickery is banned and other similar combo decks aren't. Other combo decks like Goblin Charbelcher are still allowed in Modern, and you can make similar arguments about those decks. For those who don't know, Charbelcher is a deck that tries to cast and activate Charbelcher without playing any lands in their deck using cards like modeled dual-face lands, which aren't considered lands for Charbelcher's ability, and rituals to make the 7 mana you need. However, there are a few differences here. First off, Charbelcher is easier to interact with. Charbelcher decks can sometimes play similarly to Trickery decks, but they often have to play their Charbelcher and not activate it on the same turn, which opens them up to more forms of interaction. They're also weak to more sideboard hate, being weak to basically all the cards Trickery decks are, as well as effects like Pithing Needle. It's also less consistent, as there are only 4 Charbelchers, whereas Trickery had many Cascade spells it could play. Finally, Charbelcher also has a lot more moving parts, taking a lot more skill to pilot and play against. Charbelcher has to think about how it uses its rituals and how to use cards like Recross the Paths to help find their combo pieces. The mulligan decision is a lot deeper in Charbelcher, whereas in Trickery decks it was literally just, do I have a Cascade spell, yes or no. Trickery really does feel like flipping a coin to see if you win a lot of the time, with very few real decisions for either player to make. Because of just how little interaction and actual decision goes into playing Trickery, it was considered a uniquely unfun deck that needed to be banned. Could Tibalt's Trickery be unbanned? No. Again, the problem with this card wasn't the power level, it was how unfun it was. This just isn't the kind of deck Wizards think should exist in Modern. It is worth mentioning that decks like this do exist in older formats like Legacy, where there are tons of combo decks that just kind of force you to have a Force of Will in hand. The thing is, everyone kind of knows that's how Legacy works. It's a format that's held together by 0-mana interactions, and blue being overrepresented in the metagame is expected. Modern follows the philosophy of trying to allow more colors and more types of decks to exist in it, and Trickery is more of a problem in that kind of metagame, because you're not expecting everybody to be running counterspells or lock pieces to specifically stop these kinds of combo decks. How could Tibalt's Trickery be unbanned? Simply making it so that it can only counter spells you don't control would fix the card. Funnily enough, the milling a random number of cards line was designed to stop Trickery from being able to be used in the way it was, to stop players from using things like Brainstorm to hide Urmikuls on the top of their library. I don't know why they didn't just use as much simpler line of text, as they've done similar things before, and it would actually make the card easier to resolve anyway. Alright, and that's the video. If you have any ideas for future videos similar to this one, go ahead and leave them down in the comment down below.